Hi everyone, Steve here. Welcome to this edition of Monday Morning Musing. I am hoping that this is going to be our last shot, our wrap up on our very introductory survey to some of Plato's thought and how Plato's thought influences the church. I've convinced you by now that the idea of the eternality of the soul came from Plato and very early migrated into the church. We're going to get to the scriptures in the next few sessions. In the sense of what do the scriptures say? What do some of the church fathers believe? But I'm just going to put it out there now that the doctrine of the eternality of the soul migrated into the church very early. There are a couple of other ideas of Plato's that I want to express in this episode. Basically, use this episode as a wrap up on the survey, if you can call it that, of Plato's thought. Then we're going to get into the scriptures and we're going to look at what the Old Testament has to say about it and what the New Testament has to say about it. In addition to the idea of the eternality of the soul, Plato had the concept of a world of pure ideas and pure forms. That is, the invisible, what Christians would call the spirit realm, where everything exists in perfection, particularly pure ideas and pure forms. And what Plato taught is the soul's pursuit, the subconscious drive in a human being is to want to go back to that world of purity, that world of pure ideas and pure forms. It's the realms of ideas. It's the realms of forms that are perfect. So everything in creation is basically a contaminated version of something that exists in an ideal state. And Plato says something very interesting concerning eros, E-R-O-S. For us, eros, erotic, that word, and even the way that the Greek, we handle the Greek in that, it normally is just associated with sexual things. But Plato taught something very interesting. He said that eros is actually a good thing. It's a word that Christians normally interpret as love, sexual love. But Plato said that eros is actually the divine spark in every human being that subconsciously motivates it to want to go back to that world of pure forms. That eros is the unconscious power that drives the eternal soul to want to go back home. E.T. call home. Very interesting. It's just another example that when you can't just do word studies and get a definition of a word, from your Strong's Concordance, and you think that's what it is. These words often have multiple layers, particularly amongst the folks that use them. So for Plato, eros wasn't just, sexual, related with sexuality, but rather it was a form of love that longs for its purer state and its purer residence and its purer abode. And of course, Plato taught, being a philosopher, it is by pursuing knowledge that we get back to that pure state. The soul supposedly longs to return, to go home. Saints, how much Christian language have you heard about longing to go home? We're just passing through here. Our home is in heaven. Do you see just a straight across transference of some basic Platonic thought? I'm going to move on. There's another nugget that comes from Plato that I want to mention in this session. Think about this. If your soul's eternal, that means it existed in time before creation, and it can't be destroyed because it's immortal, what are you going to do with it when you die? Well, it has to go someplace because it has to exist forever because it is constitutionally, according to Plato, immortal and eternal. So now You get developing the idea of an eternal state of blessedness and an eternal state of punishment. See, sometimes when we read the scriptures, we think that doctrine of everlasting punishment, and that's Bible. It came from the Bible. That thought preceded your New Testament. And I want to give you just a couple of quotes. If you want to go deeper on this particular topic, listen, I have a whole video series on the development of the doctrine of hell, in the sense of the three different words for hell and why they don't mean hell and why they're translated poorly. And I just want to give you an example, a couple of examples. The idea, again, that the beautiful soul goes to heaven, of course, but the soul that's been guilty of the worst crimes, and for whatever reason that sometimes he doesn't really define, but the soul that is incurable and has no erotic, no drive for perfection and beauty, Plato taught that soul goes to everlasting punishment, where that soul suffers painful and fearful torments as the penalty of their sin. Then he called it a prison house, and that because the soul would be in pain for eternity, it was supposed to serve as an example to warn the living. Does that not sound familiar to you? It makes sense that if the soul is eternal, you have to do something with it. And I'm going to read a quote from Plato, because it ties into something that the New Testament speaks of. Now, this is from one of Plato's dialogues, and I'm going to read it. Now, in the days of Kronos, there existed a law regarding the destiny of humanity, which has always been and still continues to be in heaven, that he who has lived all his life in justice and holiness shall go when he's dead to the islands of the blessed and dwell there in perfect happiness out of the reach of evil. But that he who has lived unjustly and impiously shall go to the house of vengeance and punishment, which is called Tartarus. Again, a carryover into common Christian belief. Even the reference to Tartarus. The scriptures in the New Testament talks about the angels that fell being chained in Tartarus. That idea, my friends, of Tartarus as a place of torment didn't come by divine inspiration into the Bible. It came from Greek philosophy. As for me, I don't believe in Greek philosophy. I don't believe in Tartarus, even though there's a verse in the scriptures that says it supposedly exists. That's why even folks like Martin Luther and the early critics of the Bible wanted some letters and some epistles out of the scriptures, or even to this day, some Lutherans have 2 Peter, Jude, and the book of Revelation at a lower level of canonical authority. They're in the back of some modern Lutheran Bibles. I just want to bring it out. We could go on and on and on in the details of this. That's things that people think are biblical. They're in the Bible. They came from the Bible. Have a pedigree. They have a history. They came from someplace, and most of them came from Plato. What Plato taught, and I've heard this, As the tree falls, there it lies. Otherwise, whatever characteristics of nobility that soul acquires in this life, when that soul dies, that's it. And when your soul is separated from your body, if you have a beautiful soul, you go to heaven. And if you have an ugly soul, you go to Tartarus. With just a couple of tweaks, a couple of twists, a couple of redefinitions, that gets Christianized. And there's another place in Plato where he talks about Socrates before he took the hemlocks. He drank the hemlock, the poison hemlock. Plato says that the reason Socrates could drink the hemlock and poison himself is because he's so certain of the soul's immortality, and that the soul's immortal mansions in glory are being held in reserve for him. Have you heard? Have you sung about mansions in glory? That phrase has a pedigree, and that pedigree is Platonic. And by the way, my personal conviction, that's a bad translation. So my friends, as I wrap up this session dealing with a superficial introduction to Plato, I hope I have just given you enough nuggets, at the very least, that you might pursue your own journey of educating yourself on these things. Because it is my conviction, as I said at the beginning, these thoughts have virally infected Christianity from the very, very earliest stages. Next session, we're going to start looking at the scriptures. We're going to begin looking at the Judaic scriptures, what we call the Old Testament, and we're going to see what they actually really say about the soul. And I'll see you next time.